So, hello everyone, and welcome to another presentation. I've asked James Braha to come on and talk today. James Braha is a very well-known Jyotishi and Vedic astrologer, and I've known James quite a long time. And before I introduce him, I'll just explain how I knew him, so people, or how I know you, so people get a feeling of how we connected. So a long time back, when I was writing my Jyotish book, I was asked by the publisher if I could get somebody to write a foreword, and I wrote to quite a few well-known Vedic astrologers, just on the off chance, really, that one would come back. And weirdly, the only one that replied to me was James, which was rather nice. And we spoke briefly, and he had a quick look at the book. And then he sort of decided, I think you decided at the time it was maybe you were kind of like, maybe you'd want to write for it, maybe you wouldn't. You were a bit undecided. I think the subject, because of the way I'd approached the subject, it was a little bit off the beaten track. But anyway, to cut a long story short, it was all good, and you came back, and then I think in the end it all worked out well because you were sort of glad that you did it, and then as a consequence of that, you asked me if I'd be interested in updating you or helping you update your books. You've written a number of books on Vedic astrology, and you just really wanted to give them a facelift and bring them like a revised edition. And I said, yes, I'd be happy to do that. I have a little bit of a background in graphics and stuff. So I just helped James repackage these books, if you like, and bring them up to speed. And then there was new things that were added. And then after we'd revamped the older books, you actually had a new book, which you'd written and were wanting to introduce. So that's kind of our connection, isn't it? We sort of just connected through the books.
Yeah, but that's a bit of an understatement.
Okay.
You sent me the book. I said, first of all, when you wrote me, I said I would be glad to write a foreword. Send me the book. I like to help other astrologers. For God's sake, we're brothers, right? I look at the book and I go, this thing is so beyond me. It's your connection with the Vedic world is more extreme than mine. Your understanding of technical subjects, especially all the stuff about the astrological ayanamsha, and your book was just, it was very academic. And I said, look, I'm a practicing astrologer. I practice, but I don't go reading lots of scriptures. I don't go into the far off details. I just like to give an accurate astrology reading. I'd be glad to help you, but I'm not the right one for this. You said, look, I need this, please. And I said, all right, if you want, I will. And I was glad to. I was glad to, because I learned some things about the ayanamsha, which is a very important figure used in Jyotish, that I had never come across before. I was pretty stunned by it, and it's never left me. So I was thrilled that I learned that and happy to help you.
I mean, I'm not really painting myself as an academic, but let's just say that we had a different approach to it. So that we'll just leave it at that. I don't want to sort of set myself up as some knowledge of academic, but I mean, we just had a different approach to it. And yes, I'm happy that you were able to do it.
Okay.
So I think before we sort of get into a kind of more in-depth discussion, maybe what would be really interesting, I think, is a sort of a brief background about, how you got interested in this subject, because I know that initially you were working with the Western system, but just how did you actually get interested in what you're doing now? What kind of pulled you in that direction? Because there are many types of astrology. I mean, you've got Chinese, Tibetan, there's many different avenues you could have explored, or just stuck with the Western and done more with that. But what kind of motivated you towards that?
Okay. So here's how it started. I had a very dysfunctional childhood, extremely, extremely painful, extremely rough. And I started transcendental meditation in my third or fourth year of college. I was given the mantra for transcendental meditation. And after 3 minutes of meditating, I turned and looked at the teacher he remembered it. I talked to him years later. He said, I remember you. He said, you turned to me with this look of, oh my God, I couldn't believe that using this tiny little mantra of transcendental meditation, in 3 minutes, I went so deep. I felt so relaxed. I couldn't believe it. And I said to myself that minute, I said, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And I'm 72 and I still do meditate. So that got me into meditation. And I was headed to be an actor. I was studying at one of the best drama schools in America, Carnegie Mellon, 1969 to 73. But the meditation so affected me in a positive way that I wanted to go and meditate for several hours a day. The only way you could do that was to become a teacher of transcendental meditation. So I went to Switzerland. I became a teacher. I spent, 4 months meditating 3 times in the morning and 3 times in the afternoon, and come back a zombie, like, can hardly function. But over those 5 or 6 years, from 20 to 27 or so, I was teaching transcendental meditation. Then I was about 27. My first wife had gone to an astrologer, or no, I'm sorry. She met a dancer in her play, in a play she was in. She was an actress, and she said, there's the dancer, and she's a professional astrologer. I didn't know anything about astrology, except on the meditation courses, they used to say that Jyotish was the 8th chapter of the Vedas or something like that. And I always had an interest in it. I knew nothing about it. I spent $60 to get a reading, which was a fortune in 1977 or 78. I thought, $60? But I was just gobsmacked. I was just blown away by what she could know. Now, I was already steeped in meditation. It wasn't just transcendental meditation. It's all the teachings that were given to us about moksha, about enlightenment, about, 200% of life, Maya, all the, Hindu spiritual concepts. Okay. So then I came to hit a Rahu Dasha. For anybody that doesn't know astrology, when a person, it's not a planet, it's a calculated point called the moon's north node. When a person hits a Rahu Dasha, there are often, not always, but maybe 70, 80% of the time, big changes. In the Rahu period and sub-period, I got divorced and my father died. It was very, very intense. I was in Boston, got divorced, left Boston, went home to Miami, in North Miami Beach, and my father quickly gets cancer and dies. So from the time of becoming a teacher of meditation, my focus was on moksha. It was on enlightenment. I have a spiritual horoscope. It hit me very strongly. And I thought, what the heck is the purpose of this materialistic life when you can gain freedom? So my whole life, even though I'm known as a famous author, I brought the first Hindu astrology book to America. I'm known as that, but that's not my dharma. My dharma was always enlightenment once I began meditating. Okay. So my father dies, and I'm having 2 years of intense grief. I loved my father. He was like my best friend. It was just intense. After about a year and a half, or 2 years after his death, right around a year and a half after his death, I was so depressed. I was getting nothing done. And I thought, I've always wanted to go to India. I'm not getting anything done now because I have no energy for anything except, So I get on a plane and I go to India. Now, I had already started learning Western astrology about 3 or 4 years before I went to India. I went to India at the end of 82 and then 1984. So around 77, 78 was when I went to that astrologer. I was so blown away by what she could know that I began studying Western astrology. But I thought about becoming an astrologer, but I couldn't predict enough. Not talking about future events, looking at the horoscope and predicting how many children a person would have, what their marriage would be like. It wasn't accurate enough. So I wasn't going to be an astrologer, but I was consumed with it. But I couldn't see it being accurate enough. It was accurate enough to grab my attention, but I couldn't predict for other people enough. I had read some books, or tried to read some books on Jyotish written by Indians. And they were not accessible to the Western mind. They were written by Indians with a different mindset. Couldn't make heads or tails of them. But when I went to India, I brought about 25 horoscopes of friends and relatives, people whose lives I knew very well. And all I was doing, I was just going to India to chill out, to see India and to have a vacation because I was so sad about my father.
Mm.
So I begin traveling around, and there's nothing for me to do except travel around, but I'm still consumed about astrology. So everywhere I go, if I say, "Where's the astrologers?" So I found the very first one. I don't know. I walked into some store or something. I was talking to the guy. I was talking about astrology. He said, "Oh, let me see your chart." He was not a professional, but he looks at my chart and he says, "Oh, did some woman do something terrible to you?" I said, "Well, yeah, I just got divorced." And you know, and then I remember I said, "So is there another marriage coming?" He says, "Oh, I'm late, I have to go." Holy, I couldn't. That was the only question on my mind, was, am I going to find another wife? I was 31 at the time. Anyway, so I travel around India, and I'm meeting different astrologers, but none of them are impressing me. One of them that I actually paid for said, "You're going to write some books." And I was 31. I'd never written anything. I thought he was crazy, but I heard what he said. I said, "How many?" "A few, 5 or 6. I've got 7 books now." So he was very accurate. But the reading was not great, such that I would want to say, "Can I study with you?" So I went around India for 3 months. 2 months before I was going to leave, I had a huge desire. I said, "I'm going to learn this Jyotish." So I extended my visa for another 4 weeks. So I was with Santanam. Santanam translated the very first Horasara, Parashara Horasara Brihat, in English. He was the first one to translate it in English. And he was becoming famous when I was with him. He had already translated 2 or 3 scriptures. And so I studied with him for 6 weeks. I said, when I first met him, first of all, I thought he's going to be 60 years old. I'm 30. I'm thinking it's going to be some old guy with a beard. He's like 5 years older than me. I was like, "What is this?" And I said, does it really work?" He said, "Yes, yes." Yes,
So
yes.
this guy was very sort of academic, isn't he? The first teacher was kind of more like he wasn't a practicing astrologer per se. He was kind of
He
more.
was both. Okay.
Right.
Like there were times when I would put a horoscope in front of him and he would blow my mind by what he would say. He was very accurate. And I'll tell you something else. Years later, a couple of years later, I wrote Ancient Hindu Astrology for the Modern Western Astrologer. I wrote it in 85. It came out in 1986.
Mm.
And in 1993 or 1997, somewhere in the 90s, the Vedic astrology people in America said, "Can you get your teacher Santanam to come over here?" I wrote him a letter.
Mm.
I said, "Could you, they want you to come to," they only knew him because of me, because I had written the book and he was my teacher. So we were trying to get Santanam to come to the Vedic Astrology Conference in America. And he kept saying, "Yes, I would like to," but he wouldn't commit himself. So the people in Sedona, they couldn't figure out why he wasn't saying a definite yes.
Mm.
And there was an astrologer who was going over to India he said, "I'll go and talk to him and see what he says." So the astrologer from Sedona goes and meets Santanam in Delhi. He says, "Listen, we need to know if you're going to come to the conference or not." He said, "I'll let you know in like August or something."
Oh, right.
He went to Benares with his son. His son was about 17 or 18. You go to Benares to die. So he knew from astrology. I don't know that he was sick. I don't know that. I never heard anything about him being sick, but he knew that something was up from his horoscope. I heard from his son, Srinivas, many years later. Srinivas was a baby. When I met Santanam in Delhi, he was a baby. But I emailed him, or he emailed me like 18 years later, wanting to learn Jyotish from me, because
Oh, wow.
he didn't learn from his father. He wanted to learn from me. Anyway, so I asked about the death, and he said, "My father," I was 17 or 18, I believe, I mean, don't quote me on that, but it's 18 or 20, around that age. They go to Benares. He has a heart attack, and I believe it's a heart attack, and dies. So he was a good astrologer, but he was translating furiously. By the time I met him, he had translated 3 classical texts. By the time he was, of his death, probably at the age of 45 or 50, he was not old. He had translated 6 or 7. around 19, I was around 50, 49 years old. It'd be around the year 2000 or so. I was invited to give a lecture at the Vedic Astrology conference in Sedona again. And I gave a lecture, and somebody from the audience came up afterwards to ask some questions. And my wife sees him. His name was Marty Wolf. My wife sees him and she says, "Oh, I know you from Fairfield." Fairfield, Iowa was the University of Maharishi. It's still there, Fairfield, Iowa. There's about 2,000 people living there, meditating every day in the dome together. And so they knew each other, so they begin talking. So I look at him and I say, "Well, I've been meditating for 30 years. Let's see, 20 to 53, 30 years or so." I said, "Nobody got enlightened." He said, "That's not true." I said, "Really?" No, nobody I knew from meditating got enlightened. He said, "I'll give you a book." And he gave me a book called Meeting Papaji. Papaji, his name was H.L. Punja, I think was Punja Ji, Papaji. They called him Papaji. His name was Punja. And so I read this book, and all of a sudden I was open to Advaita. Now, of course, in the TM days, you'd heard of Advaita. I heard the concept that the world is Maya, but it had no meaning. The world seemed certainly very real to me. So as an astrologer, I was doing readings for people on the phone that were from all over the country.
Mm.
Now I do lots from people in India and all other countries because of all the YouTubes I've done. But every time so when I would get a spiritual person, we'd start talking about enlightenment. I would mention Papaji. There were at least 10 or 20 people that I would meet through astrology, my clients. And I'd say, "You knew him?" They go, "Yes." I said, "What was it like?" I said, "Are those stories true?" They said they're absolutely true. When they would get around Papaji, suddenly they would begin to feel pure consciousness and bliss, etc. And when I was reading the Advaita books, a friend said to me, Meryl Barrett's, she said, "Listen, you know what? If you're reading Advaita, the best one is Sailor Bob Adamson." Who is this guy? So he had a book called, he's still alive, he's 91, had a book called What's Wrong with Right Now Unless You Think About It. So I'll make a long story short. I managed to get Sailor Bob. I paid for a vacation for him and his wife to come to my house for a vacation. And all he wanted to do was teach non-duality, Advaita. So for 5 weeks, people came from all over America when they heard that I had him at my house, because they had read his books or seen his videos. So people came to my house for these 5 weeks. And Sailor Bob was a student of Muktananda originally.
Where was he based then? Where was Sailor Bob?
Australia, Melbourne,
Australia.
Australia.
So he came from Australia yeah.
And he's still there, and he's about 91.
Wow.
91 or 94. You know what? I might be 95, 94. Anyway, Sailor Bob, at the age of around, I don't know, 30 or 35, he had started meditating. Okay. Now he's about 25 years older than me, but he had started meditating with TM also. And then he left Australia. He said, "I'm going to India and I'm not coming back until I gain moksha, until I gain enlightenment. I'm not coming home." So he goes to Muktananda's ashram, and Muktananda is telling them, "You're already enlightened. There's, what you're seeking, you already are, but nobody can hear it." So Sailor Bob at some point is in a bookstore in India, and the guy at the bookstore sees this is a serious spiritual seeker. He says, "You need to see Nisargadatta." Goes to Nisargadatta, and Nisargadatta gives him a strong dose of Advaita, a strong dose of non-duality. And as Sailor Bob tells it, he says, I got it. I was thrilled. And then I left his flat, and in 5 minutes I was back into duality. I was back into believing that the world is real. But he went back for some weeks every day, and they would talk and they would talk. And eventually Sailor Bob got it, came back to Australia. And Sailor Bob, the reason he's called Sailor Bob is because he was in AA. He was an alcoholic. He went to AA to get off of alcohol, and they don't use last names. There were 5 Bobs in AA, so they had, so he'd been in the Navy, so they called him Sailor Bob.
Oh, I got it.
So that's how he became. So now he goes back to Australia. He's gotten what he wants, and he opens up a health food store, and people, his other alcoholics that he knew from AA, are coming into the health food. He says, I can help you. Come to my meetings. And he starts having these meetings. And so he was giving non-duality. So he came to America, to my house, and he was there for 5 weeks, and I peppered him with nonstop questions. And I started writing the book, Living Reality. I started writing the book before he left my house. I was just telling the story of what had happened. And
so we should say that the culmination of this visit actually finished with you writing the book, which is the Living Reality book. And so this is literally like an essay on his trip, what happened, because I laid the book up as well for you, and we placed all the images, and I was kind of, not that I got any background in Advaita, but I was kind of picking and reading through bits while I was laying it up. So it's done very much like a dialogue, isn't it? The book is a sort of dialogue between him and people that you'd invited.
It's a dialogue, but it's different from the other dialogue books because you're talking about one guy who is seeking enlightenment, having him in my house, asking every darn question I could ask. I asked the questions that were silly, that were crazy, because I was so hungering for liberation. But in between the dialogues, I would be explaining how all this fit in. So it's a really powerful book and a fun book. But not only that, I had 4 or 5 friends that were also TM teachers that were seeking enlightenment. And so in the book, you get to meet these other people that are asking him questions. It's very, very personal. So he was there for 5 weeks, and I'm asking him questions, and I'm getting flooded with non-duality. From that day on, I was never the same. I'm completely the same as I always was. I'm also never the same, because that monkey on my back of separation and of seeking enlightenment, the seeking was the biggest suffering I had, thinking there's something else I have to get. And someday in another lifetime, I'm going to get that and I'll be whole. Suddenly that was gone. I just felt whole. That's never gone away. And when people read my book and they email me and they say, so I've read the book and I've been in non-duality. I want to know, you've been with it now for 10, 15, 20 years. What's the difference between now and when you got it in 2004 at the age of 53? What's the difference? I said, what is different, or how it's grown? It doesn't really grow, because once you're free, you're free. It doesn't change. But what has happened is that over the years, the longer I live, the more clear it is that I know nothing except one thing. All I know is I am. Consciousness is I am. Consciousness, I am. Everything else is a concept and a belief. And the concepts and beliefs have no meaning to me. I know I am because I can close my eyes and there it is. Awareness is there. Everything else is a concept and a belief, and I don't care about them. That's what's changed. I'm sorry, what was your question now?
Well, obviously somebody like that, he obviously knew something about your background, and he knew that you were a writer and you did astrology books. So I just wondered how the whole concept of astrology would work. How did he feel about astrology? Did he feel
first of all, the way I got him to come and visit, I couldn't get on a plane to go to Australia because I had a panic attack on a plane a few years before that. I couldn't go because I said, I'm not getting on a plane to go to Australia. But the way I was able to convince him was I took my second book, which is an autographical book called Astrologos, Revelations of a Hindu Astrologer. Because like he and his wife wanted to come to America to have a vacation, but their friends said to them, are you crazy? You don't know who this guy is. They read the book and they said, oh, this is a spiritual guy. They got a feeling for my nature. They said, it'll be okay. So I'll never forget the night they showed up. It was like they had been traveling for 26 hours and they were exhausted. We went to pick them up at the airport. And of course, I was wondering, is this guy going to be a fraud or is he for real? I'd read his book and I was, really moved by it. But I wanted to look in his eyes. And as soon as we saw them, I looked in his eyes and I said, oh, yeah, this guy he's free. You can tell he's free. And they saw us and they were worried about the cottage that they were going to be staying in. So when we get them home, we had just built a cottage a couple of years before. It's brand new. And he opens the door and they were like so relieved that they were going to be staying in a place that was comfortable.
Wow.
So as far as astrology, they didn't know anything about astrology, but I tried to explain to them that from the viewpoint of the world, yes, it's true. There is no, the true self cannot be cut by the sword. This is in the Gita, Bhagavad Gita. The true self cannot be cut by the sword, burned by fire, blown by wind, or drowned by water. So everything else is just a dream. This is such a relief, I can hardly tell you. Half the world believes that the world is Maya, but almost nobody lives like that. When you actually get that all there is awareness, all this other crap is just transitory. When you get that, everything becomes just much lighter, because it's not real anyway. So, but if the toilet overflows, I don't say, oh, it's not real. I call a plumber. So even though it became irrelevant, what happens in the future becomes kind of irrelevant because the world's not real. Of course it's relevant if my son or my wife has an accident or there's trouble coming. That's what you use astrology for, to see if there's as an astrologer, I have recommended yagyas, pujas, homas. I call them yagyas. I use them in my practice. I've used them since 1983. When I see a bad period, I tell the person, go get a 9-day yagya. If people go to my website, jamesbraha.com, they'll see a whole section on non-duality and they'll see a section on yagyas. And so I would advise them to get a 9-day yagya to relieve the suffering, to relieve the problem that is about to occur. So yes, the world is not real, but in the world we live in the dream world, it is real. Also, Sailor Bob wanted me to teach non-duality, and I did teach for a while, maybe 7-8 months. I really wasn't comfortable with people coming in and looking at me like I was different from them. I didn't like that. It puts you on a pedestal where you can only fall. That's all you can do is fall, or you can go crazy from ego and power. I didn't want any of that. I did teach non-duality for a while, but it didn't really fit in the dream world. Personalities, karma doesn't stop just because you gain liberation. The karma keeps going. It's just that when the karma comes back, it doesn't have as big of an effect because you're not attached to it. Not as attached.
That book's quite interesting, isn't it? Because really, it's the only of the 5 or 6 books you've written, that's the only one that's just really nothing to do with astrology at all. It's just.
I'm going to tell you something I always love to say. I've written 6 astrology books. One of them was the one that brought Vedic astrology to the Western world. I have in back of me 3 scrapbooks filled, hundreds of letters before the internet. It was written in 86. I have hundreds of letters from people all over the world, from famous Indian astrologers because of that book, okay? But I have a friend who's not an astrologer. I met him on a TM course, 45 years ago, whatever it is. And when I came out with Living Reality, the book on Advaita, he said, Jimmy, you finally wrote a book worth something. Because he's not an astrologer.
I don't think that's completely true, but yeah, I get.
But he's not an astrologer. I finally wrote something. I finally wrote something that that could.
I mean, in all honesty, we should say, looking across if we go back to that lady you were speaking about who gave you the initial reading, that's actually quite early to get a Vedic astrology reading. But the fact
that was Western.
Oh, it was a Western. Okay.
That was a Western reading.
So, but the fact is, that kind of spurred you to go to India, get your training, and then to come back and then write that book. I remember when I was learning, there were perhaps a handful of books written by Westerners. This was after your book, but I did actually buy your book. It was one of the first books I read. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, thank God, it's kind of in a language that's really easy to read. It was very practical. It was very step by step. And what was great was you did a whole big section in the middle where you just literally say, in this house, this planet means this, and this planet means that. It was really broken down and a really useful, really useful section of the book. It was the biggest part of the book, I think, isn't it? Where you're planets and houses, planets and signs.
Well, it's the sun through all 12 houses, the moon through all 12. If is a monster to write. But let me just tell you this. When I went to India, I brought 25 Western horoscopes with me. I wouldn't bet 10 cents that I was going to learn the Vedic system. People said, "Oh, are you going to learn Hindu astrology when you go?" I said, "If it's possible, I will, but I don't think it is because I've read those books." And the problem with the books was twofold. One was that they're written in a way that is exaggerated, but the Indians know that. Like it would say, if a planet is exalted but retrograde, it's fallen. Well, it's not fallen. It's just not as powerful. If a planet is fallen but retrograde, it's exalted. Well, it's not exalted. It's just better. So they would exaggerate certain things. I didn't know that. So I would read something like I have Saturn in the 5th house. It would say, if Saturn is in the 5th house, the scriptures would say, if Saturn is in the 5th house, the person will have lost his mind and be found roaming in the jungles. I'm speaking literally. The person will have lost his mind and be found wandering in the jungles. What could you do with this? Because I have this and I'm not wandering in the jungle. I haven't lost my mind. If a person has Mars in the 3rd house, he will lose 2 fingers. I didn't know I couldn't figure. Come to find out, they're exaggerating. Saturn in the 5th house, the 5th house is the mind. Saturn is restrictive. So if Saturn's in the 5th house, the person can be depressed. The mind is heavy. But they would say he's lost his mind. If there's a malefic in the house, in the 3rd house, which is the hands, they'll say he loses 2 fingers. It means the person has trouble with his hands, or the person has trouble getting things done, which is the hands. It's always exaggerated. But so I didn't, this is why those texts didn't work. But the other problem, now I don't know if this is still true or not, but back in 1980, and of course these books would have been written before 1980, the poverty was pretty strong in India. And so nobody had any money to speak of. So what an astrologer had was his knowledge. So they would do horoscope readings, but they didn't give out their knowledge, their experience. They didn't give it out that freely. So they would write books because they wanted to be known, but they didn't want to really share their secrets. And I can tell you, when I studied with both teachers, Santanam, and in Bombay, 2 years later, I studied with P.M. Padia in Bombay. Both of these guys, they would say, "James, I have given you my secrets." Because they didn't write their secrets in the books because they wanted.
Yeah.
So it was very hard. So I didn't really believe I was going to come back knowing Hindu astrology, but I did.
How much of the book, when you came back, how much of the book had you kind of mentally written or had in notes? So in other words, when you actually wrote it, how much?
Here's how it happened. I came back from India. I started doing readings, and I met a friend named Jindal Hussain, who is another seeker, and he studied Sanskrit. We got together and we said, let's write a book. So I started writing a book, and it just was no good. I couldn't write. It just didn't work. After a month or so, I said, this is not working. So I used the astrology for about a year. And I was pretty good at it. And I used the Western system and the Hindu. So I was getting pretty good. The Western was a little bit more psychological. The Indian was a little bit more event-oriented. But occasionally, the event stuff would be inaccurate. And it was starting to bother me. And one day I was now 31 or 32, and I ran into an old high school friend that I hadn't seen in a decade. And I said, come on over to my house. I'll look at your horoscope. I'll tell you, right? So I'm doing his horoscope. And I see this period of a couple of years ago. And I said, oh, this looked like a good period. He said, really? That's when I tried to kill myself. I was so floored by this that on the very next day, I got on the phone to an agent. I said, I need a trip to India. I need a flight to India. I could. So that's when I went back to India. Okay. Then I studied, I don't know, a month or two with PM Padia in Bombay. I come back, and remember, now, the first astrologer I ever met, professional, said I would write books, but, I tried to write a book. It didn't work. So I come back, and I'm just thrilled with the knowledge that I've learned, right? And I just start to write down. The things that I've learned, but I started with the planets and the houses. I mean, this is odd to me right now because I already understood planets and houses, but for some reason I said, I'm going to write down, because my head was just bursting with all the knowledge, all the information. So I start writing down the sun in the first house, the sun in the second house. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, oh my God, this is coming out really good. This is really clear. And I start writing, and I wrote for 7, 8, 9 months without a day off, because it was coming out like a book. And I said, somebody else has got to be writing the same book, for God's sake. I've got to get there first. So I'm writing every day. And it's really funny because I took one day off. I took off on a Sunday, went to the beach, and I brought some paper with me, and I wrote the introduction at the beach. So I never took a day off.
Wow.
Yeah. It was really, but I have to tell you, that was a Saturn Bhukti. And Saturn in my horoscope, it's the one planet in my horoscope that is phenomenal. Every time I hit a Saturn Bhukti, my life goes way up to the top. So I tried to write 2 years earlier, nothing happened. I tried to write in the Saturn Bhukti. Saturn's my Raja Yoga Karaka. It's in the 5th house. It's aspected to the degree by Jupiter. Every time I hit a Saturn Bhukti, my life goes way up. So that's when the book was written, and that's when it came out.
Yeah, it was a really good find early on. I think it was one of the first books I obviously, by the time I got into this, there were other authors that had kind of followed along and written books from a Western perspective, but that one was always kind of recognized. And it's got such a distinctive cover on it. It's a big book. It's got a really nice cover on it. You can't not read it.
I'll tell you something about this that's interesting. If you are the first that does anything, that's it. You get imprinted, because a couple of years after my book, there was a David Frawley book, and then a Ronnie Dreyer book. There was, but those books came out. But if anybody went to a bookstore, even after those books were out, what gets imprinted is the person that did it first. Yeah, so it's very lucky.
The one that's actually the most interesting to me is your art and practice, because that's the one when we first started conversing, and then you said, have you read Art and Practice? And it's the one that I'd never even been aware of. I mean, I have got lots of astrology books, but I didn't have a copy of that. So you said, oh, you should really read it. And when I read it, I thought, this is so good, because it's a
let me tell you something odd about that. That book had really weird karma. It was ahead of the times. I don't know, but my books were selling in London. They were selling in the UK. My books were selling. I couldn't get any bookstore to buy the Art and Practice. Don't ask me why. I had a fight with my distributor. I said, how can no bookstore be buying this? They've got my other books. Why are they not buying it? And I was blaming the distributor. Like, how can you not get this book in the stores?
I think it was just a bit ahead of its time, really. I think even now when I read it, it's just a great resource book, and it's written in a dialogue with teacher and student. So you kind of
So now this is a great story, how important the yagyas are. This is a story about the yagyas. So I started astrology in 1983. flash forward to 1999, and by now I've written Ancient Hindu Astrology for the Modern Western Astrologer, Astrologos, which is the autobiography of going to India, How to Be a Great Astrologer, which is Western Aspects, How to Predict Your Future, which is Transits. So now I've written 4 books while I'm also trying to make a living doing readings. And those books that I wrote, they are researched. They are. So by 1988, 89, I was exhausted. And I said, I am not going to write another book and keep doing readings. It's too exhausting. But I wanted to write one. I have Mercury in the 6th house, aspected by a full moon. So I'm a natural writer, even though I didn't even think of that until that guy, when I was 31, said, you're going to write books. It eventually. So I wanted to write a book analyzing horoscopes, but I did not want to sit in a room for 3 hours. I would only write 3 hours a day. After that, my mind would be fried. But I didn't want to do that because it was exhausting. So I used to get a lot of yagyas done, because every time I would recommend 10 or 20 people for yagyas, they would say, James, hey, you want a yagya? You want a yagya? So I used to get a lot of them. So I said to my wife, I said, Vashti, you want a yagya? She says, yeah. I said, what do you want? She says, Mercury. Okay. Now, when you're married, the karma is, is mixed. So we get a Mercury yagya. They pray for 7-9 days for Mercury. For years, I'd wanted to redo all my musical equipment. I needed a new stereo. I needed new equipment. But I never would get around to it. They do a yagya for Mercury, and suddenly I'm getting that done. During the 7 days of the yagya, a thought occurs. Hey, you could write that book you want to write without the exhaustion. Get a student, teach them Jyotish, record the sessions. It'll be easy. So I get a student, and I teach him Jyotish. Now, in the end, even though the sessions were all recorded, and I even paid somebody to transcribe those recordings, but when I got to the transcriptions, I couldn't leave it alone. I kept altering it, so that I wound up writing the book with all the questions that he asked and all the questions that I wanted to answer for students. And that turned out to be, that was 15 years after I had begun astrology. And I got so many letters and emails saying, I've been studying the Hindu system, but I couldn't become a practitioner until I got that book. Now put it all together, because I'm seeing how you're analyzing horoscopes. And I made sure, because I sat there writing the questions. I took Martin's questions, the student, answered all of those, but I put in my own questions to make sure that they would, what I thought they would want to know. And so I would get these letters and emails saying, it's like I was in the room with you.
Yeah, that's totally true. I remember when I was reading it, I kept thinking, yes, that's good. But what would happen if this was the case? And then two paragraphs down, you say, and if this was the case, it would be like this. And so you anticipated all the questions.
In the Western horoscope, I have 4 planets in Libra. Libra is always thinking about the other person. So when I'm writing, I'm thinking, what are they hearing? What are they hearing? What do they want to know?
Can I just ask, so just going back to when you were studying with Santanam, so did you take more horoscopes with you to discuss with him? And was it a same kind of principle? Did you sort of sit down and, like, for instance, if you gave him a horoscope of a friend, did he have a particular way that he would tackle each one, or were they just freestyle? Would he look at each he had no
completely freestyle.
Freestyle, yeah.
Santanam was the first one, so I bought about 20 horoscopes. When I went back to Bombay, I brought more different ones, but I would put a horoscope in front of him and he would start talking. Now, with both Santanam and Padilla, there were lots of times when they would say something that would be startlingly accurate. And I'd say, where are you seeing that from? And they would make up some answer that to me was just nonsense. It was coming psychically. But they taught me, I mean, they were using the horoscopes for sure, but occasionally something would come out of their mouth that was not in the horoscope. And I'd say, where's that? And then they would, but it was very different.
Any accompanying charts? Or would they look at, were they interested in the divisionals? Would they want all the divisional charts there as well, or not so bothered, just mainly the main horoscope?
We used the Navamsha and the Dasamsha.
And how were they calculating as well? If they did their own charts, were they doing it all manually, or were they using probably too early for software? Was it?
It was just the beginning of software, but what was happening was I brought Western horoscopes with me. He taught me how to turn them into Vedic by subtracting 23 degrees. They taught me how to do the dashas. So I would study with Santanam from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock, or from 7 to 11, something like that, every night. So what was I doing all day long? I was taking these horoscopes and transcribing them into Vedic charts with Navamsha and Dasamsha. Now, most interesting, we would talk every night about these, my friends, and they would say this and say this, and I was going, my God, this is incredible. So I say, let's do my horoscope. And Santanam said, for your horoscope, I want to have Shadbala. Well, Shadbala is a calculation system that would take 2 days if you did it by hand. So he said, we will mail away to get the computerized horoscope.
Oh, right. So he was using some computer calculations at that time.
But not with my charts, because I was just putting them in front of them. But I guess if he was doing a client, he might mail away for Shadbala. It took 2 weeks for him to write the letter and make the payment, and for them to send back the Shadbala from the computer. It would take 2 weeks. By the time he got my horoscope back with the Shadbala, I look at the horoscope and it was calculated wrong. I said, this is not my chart.
Wow.
So I was in India for 6 weeks with Santanam, and I never had my heart. I mean, yes, he would look at it a little bit, but he wouldn't really go into it because he wanted to be most accurate. So I never got a reading from Santanam.
But in a way, that's just the way it worked out. I mean, you got much more in many other ways. You came back with a technique, and you were then able to apply it.
When I went back the second time to Bombay, to Padia, we talked about my chart a lot. He didn't need the Shadbala anyway. He wasn't using that. So to be honest, you have to understand, I didn't know anything when I was with Santanam in 82, late 82 and early 83. I didn't know anything. So he's not analyzing horoscopes that much. He's teaching me what the planets mean, what the signs mean, what the aspects are, what the yogas are. So even though we did get some horoscope interpretation, it was mainly teaching me the principles. When I got back in 84, now I already knew the system. So we're just looking at horoscopes.
And going back to obviously you had some knowledge of Western before you went. So at what point did
if I had not had the knowledge of Western astrology, there's no way I would have learned what I learned in 4 weeks. There's no 6 weeks. There's no way. But not only that, but I knew things from Western astrology that were not being used in the Hindu system. People were not using the degrees. They didn't care if Saturn aspected your sun within 5 degrees or 25 degrees. This is something that in my books I have promoted so much so that in India now they are using the degrees. You have to look at that. You have to look at the reason they weren't looking at them was because in the horoscope, they wouldn't put Saturn at 5 Libra and Jupiter at 10 Libra. They would put the sun at 215 degrees and the other planet at 227 degrees. You wouldn't use it like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I wondered how much of that had actually influenced when you were looking and reinterpreting these charts using the Vedic system, how much were you thinking kind of Western and making the translations, or did you just clear your mind and just think?
I cleared my mind because I wanted to get their system. But as I began practicing, then I'll tell you a story. when I had that Rahu Dasha began, and my wife, we divorced and my father died, that was a very intense experience. There were a lot of things that changed. And one of the things that changed was I started having a very strong sense of destiny. From 79 all the way until 84, it was clear, I just had a real strong sense that I would be famous or be known or have something like that, a big career, but nothing was happening. So when I was with Padilla the second time, I said, for 5 years now, I've had this feeling I'm going to have a big career and have some fame or recognition, but nothing ever happens. Is it in the horoscope or not? So he says, yes. He looks at it, he says, yes, you'll have some fame because the ruler of the 10th house is in the 5th, Purva Punya, past life credit, aspected by Jupiter. So you'll have some fame. But what he didn't know, and by now I was beginning to realize the degrees were critical. So I'm looking to see, is he just saying this or is it really there? So I'm looking at the chart and suddenly it occurs to me, the 10th ruler is not just aspected by Jupiter. It's aspected by Jupiter within minutes. That's where the fame and recognition comes in. He didn't know that. They didn't look at degrees. But now after 3 or 4 years, I was beginning to add. The Indians did not know about a stationary planet. In the scriptures, it says the slower it is, the more powerful it is, but they never mentioned stationary. I knew that from the Western system. So there's a lot of things, because I've used Hindu and Western. You read my books, there's a lot of things that are going on in Jyotish now that are coming from the knowledge that I had from the Western. I do not mix the systems, but if there is something, if there's an aspect that means something in the Western chart, it's going to mean the same thing in the Hindu.
If you had to sort of pick out one thing, like a primary, so somebody's come in, they've given you a birth data, you've constructed the chart, you're kind of looking at what's the primary thing that you're focusing on? When your eye falls on the chart, what's the first thing that's kind of catching you? Is it just a general layout, or have you got something specific that you'll go for,
My nature has always been long-term. It's always been the broad viewpoint. This is why when I learned meditation, I said, oh my God, this is what life is about. This is the big picture. I've always been like that. So when I was studying astrology, of course, I had to learn all the pieces like everybody else, all the pieces. But my nature was to try to look at the chart as a whole. And the analogy that I use is that it's like driving a car. When you drive a car, you have to learn the brakes, the steering wheel, the mirror. If you get everything correct but the brakes, you'll kill somebody. If you get everything but the steering wheel or the pedal, you're going to kill somebody. So when you're looking at a horoscope, you're looking at pieces, but you have to look at the whole chart. That's what you have to look at. Otherwise, you'll get readings like I got. I never got a good astrology reading from anybody because all I would get would be pieces. They wouldn't see the whole. So I'm always looking at the whole. But when you talk about that, there's about 6 different things that I'm looking at right at the start. Is the birth time on the hour? Then I got to question the birth time. Is the ascendant right on the cusp, 0 degrees or 29 degrees? Where is the moon? Look, the foundation of the chart, the foundation of every horoscope is the ascendant, the moon, and the sun. You could have a great Jupiter, you could have a great Saturn, you could have a great Mercury, but you want to know what is the foundation of the person. If the sun, the moon, and the ascendant, which includes ascendant ruler, sun, moon, ascendant ruler, if they are afflicted, the person goes through life fearful, difficult, is very rough. If the ascendant, the sun and the moon, ascendant ruler are all strong, they go through life, barreling through life. It's very easy. Of course, there are going to be mixtures. The ascendant's great, but the moon is terrible. So that's what I'm looking at right away. I want to know, who is this person? How are they getting through life? Forget whether they're an artist or a famous, or who are they? The ascendant, the moon, the sun. So where is the ascendant ruler? Is it in the house of career? Is it in the house of marriage? is the sun aspected by Saturn or by Jupiter? Is it all of these things? So there's like 10 different things, honestly, that would answer your question. What do I look at first? I'm looking to see, is the chart accurate? Does it have a 10 o'clock birth time?
I think you answered it. So basically, it's a combination of many factors, but there's an overarching pattern that you're looking for. You're checking those three things initially, but it's a kind of a balance. You're looking for a distribution and a sort of general appraisal. And then if people have got specific questions, then you could go to specific planets and do that.
Yeah. There's like seven or eight things I look at. My mind, Padilla used to say to me, this was, I'm 2-3 years into it, and he said, your mind has to be a computer mind to do astrology. When I look at a chart, like the other thing, you're talking about, what do I look at first? Is there any house that's being aspected by 4 planets? Is there any planet that's being aspected by 3 planets? There's like 10 different things that I'm looking at within the first 5 minutes. But the overall is there from the start. Look at this chart as a whole. Who are,
And how much of the interpretation is relying on, say, something like the Navamsha? Are you using that quite a lot, or how many of the divisionals do you find are really worth including in that analysis?
I only find 2 divisionals to work, and they don't work the way the way they teach them. So I've never found the chart for children to work, first of all. Second of all, a lot of those charts are not going to work because the birth time has to be so precise. And I'm always looking to see whether, a Navamsha is going to have a 17, 18-minute window. The Dasamsha is going to have a 15-minute window. And where was the person born within those 15 minutes? So I don't just use the Navamsha and Dasamsha without checking to see, is it likely to be accurate? But when it comes to those charts, I tried using them the way they teach them. So I would see a career chart with 4 planets in the house of health, maybe benefics, Jupiter, Venus, Moon, Sun, in the 6th house. You'd think it'd be a healer or a hotel or a owner or a restaurant owner. But they wouldn't be, even though the 6th house was that powerful. Why not? What you want to look at in the Dasamsha is the 10th house. What's in the 10th house and what is the ruler of the 10th house doing? Forget what the rest of the chart looks like. When you're looking at marriage, you're not looking at all the whole chart. You're looking at the 7th house and the ruler of the 7th house.
Interesting.
That's what works. Now, it took me years because I took what they taught me and used them. But after 3 or 4 years, I said, this doesn't work. And then I would begin looking. When I was in India, they did not use the aspects of Rahu and Ketu. But after 4 or 5 years, I started to say these aspects work. Now they're very, very important to me.
Has that been adopted? Do you find any people are kind of following that now? They're looking more at that than before? You've mentioned that on talks, so people kind of pick that up and they're thinking, okay, I'll start looking at that. Or
there's probably a good 10% where they're getting they'll say something and it'll be very accurate. I say, they learned that from my books. I mean, I got a client recently and they said, so-and-so said that I'm probably going to have a very rough period coming up in 4 years. And I look at it and I go, that woman's using my books because it'll be something that I've hammered home and they've learned. And I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled when that happens. But I don't know the numbers. I don't hear from that many people the way used to be. I would hear from people, you do a reading and they'd say they'd come back. Oh my God, it was so accurate. I don't hear from people much anymore. They just assume that and the truth is, I know that most of what I say is accurate. Not 100%. I never trust that. But, I don't even ask for feedback because I know that 70-75% is going to be accurate. Once in a while, they say, oh, this one thing is not accurate. I say, oh, okay. But most of it, I know from experience is accurate, but they'll never be 100%. It's way too complex of a science. For that.
Yeah, one of the techniques I found really interesting is one that you mentioned earlier on. I think it's in Art and Practice where you're talking about placement by sign and by house, depending on the ascendant degree. So sometimes, you could say the planet could be in the 5th sign, but it might actually be in the, it could be
Bhava chart.
Yeah, the Bhava chart, basically. Yeah. So, I mean, I found that a really useful thing to look at because sometimes you think, well, it kind of gives the results of both. But when you look and you,
it's both. It
yeah,
is both.
yeah.
It
So
is.
that was a really good, it was a really, really useful technique.
If you don't use the Bava chart, you'll never be accurate. Now, let me tell you how hard it was for me to understand this. I would be doing it because I wasn't explained the Bava chart. I was just explained that some people use the ascendant as if any planet in the ascendant is in the house. The ascendant could be 2 degrees, Jupiter's in 28 degrees of that house, it's in the first. Other people would say ascendant's 2 degrees, Jupiter's 28, it's in the second. They would do either or. Now, I would be with Santanam, and one night we'd be looking at a chart of a friend, and he'd say, oh, Jupiter's in the 9th house. This person's going to get good religion philosophy. A week later, we'd look at the same chart. He'd say, oh, look, Jupiter's in the 8th house. They're going to be psychic. I'd say, Jupiter's in the 9th house. They'd go, yes, but still. I go, what do you mean? Yes. And wouldn't explain it to me. And finally, I learned that it's both. Now, if you went to India, some astrologers would take that chart and say strictly Jupiter's in the 9th. Some would say it's strictly in the 8th. When you use both, that's when you're more accurate.
Yeah,
these things took a long time for me to learn.
The charts done while I was in India, and every astrologer had a different way of doing it. And in the end, I wasn't really looking over their shoulder to try and figure out what they were doing. You just let them do their thing and you ask a question and just see whether it's accurate for you. But some had really curious techniques. I mean, I was just totally not really understanding what I was looking at. And I was supposed to, I should know what I'm looking at, but I just couldn't understand what they were doing and why they were doing it like that. But they were getting good results, or they were tuning into something. So it was quite interesting. And so just to sort of coming to the end and sort of wrapping up a little bit, just out of interest, now everybody's got their own preference, but so when you're doing your work now, you're working mostly with, is it the Hayden's Jyotish, isn't it? That's your preferred, is that your preferred software? Or
yeah, I prefer the simpler program because it's very easy, it's very simple. I don't like the complicated programs. I think I do a lot better by getting the basic techniques of each system rather than when you start going into these real ultra detailed things. They work sometimes and they don't. Over the course of my career, I'd be at a conference and I'd learn about some great new technique or some great technique that was, and as time would go by, they would become irrelevant. They'd work a few times, but it's really the basics that work the best. The more systems you have and you're using the basics, the more accurate you're going to be. So you can use the basics of Jaimini, the basics of Parashara, the basics of Western. The more that you get the basics, and when I tell people you've got to learn the Western and the Hindu, oh, but I haven't mastered this one. You're never going to master any of them.
Well, I get a slap on the wrist for that. I don't know anything about what. I mean, I know Western astrology and then they're very good, but I've never learned any of the techniques really, or
I mean, it's up to you. It's up to you. But what I'm saying is, rather than go, first of all, you're never going to master one system. Second of all, rather than going into the advanced techniques of these others, I'm telling you from experience that, it's like the yogas. When I was in India, I learned some of the yogas, but the yogas would work when they would work and they would not work when they didn't work. So you know what I finally figured out? Like one night I was with Santanam and he says, oh, this woman's going to be wealthy. She has Lakshmi yoga. And she was wealthy. And I said, what's Lakshmi yoga? Well, there's a lot of Lakshmi yogas, but this one was when there's a planet in the 2nd, the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th house. That's Lakshmi yoga. Now, having a planet in the 2nd, the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th has no logical connection to why that should be accurate, but it works. But it doesn't always work. So I think what happens is the Indians are extremely psychic. They are so psychic, probably from millennia of being vegetarian. They're more subtle. So I think what happens is, like, there's another time when Santanam said, oh, this person has such and such yoga. He's going to have a mellifluous voice. And this guy had one of the 5 greatest voices in the world. This is a friend of mine. He didn't become a singer, but he had a phenomenal voice, okay? And this was from a yoga. So I think what happens is that when they're psychic, the yoga pops up and they see it when it's going to be accurate, and when it's not, they don't see it.
So the voicing was based on a yoga. It wasn't anything necessarily to do with the second house. He just saw some yoga in there and just knew. Yeah, that's the real art, isn't it? It's being able to just look and then know that that's going to be activated or not, because every chart has yogas in it. It's whether
there's known to be two kinds of astrologers, and I wish I knew the name. I can't remember the name of it, but there's the name for the astrologers that use yogas, and there's the name for the ones that analyze the horoscope more microscopically, like I do.
And you're using mostly the South Indian chart as opposed to the North.
Yeah, but that's irrelevant. I mean, it's the same horoscope.
But I noticed it's really nice in the books that you give an example of both, because a lot of books, they'll either just give one or the other, and if you've learned the opposite, then it's not easy to read. Of course, you should know how to use both, but I find I'm more North Indian, so South, I have to think about what I'm looking.
Oh, it's terrible. You have to have both. When I wrote my first book, it was enough that I could get the horoscopes, because we didn't have computers. It was enough that I could get the South Indian charts in there in the original. But we updated that in 2020, and you added the North, so now in all my books.
It was really good to have that. I just thought it's like a sigh of relief when you see it in the, in both formats. It's just much better.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you also, do you think, as regards kind of software, I was going to say, a friend of mine, she's a very good Western astrologer, and I said one day, come on, teach me how to actually calculate this by hand. I'm kind of curious. I've never done it. And we spent quite a few, I don't want to say how long I spent on it, because my math is not great anyway. So doing all this stuff, and it gave me a great appreciation for it. Now, what I'd like to say is that, I don't calculate by hand. I can sort of do it if I can remember how to do it now, but it gave me a great appreciation for the software.
First of all, if I would calculate the Western chart, I could mail away for it, but it would take a week. So I would calculate the Western horoscope from the books. That would take an hour or two. Then it would take an hour or two to transpose the Western chart to the Vedic. However, and the Navamsha and Dasamsha. However, to get to those dashas and bhuktis, it would take 5-6 hours to do that. A computer does it in a second. But I don't really have any opinions about which computer program to use, except I like Hayden's Jyotish because it's very simple. He has a free Hayden's Jyotish. Jyotish.com is free online. You're supposed to give donations.
Yeah, we should mention that. That's actually a good service. So if you're thinking about getting into Jyotish and you don't want to have an initial outlay, there is a free. So Hayden's Jyotish does a free website.
It's called H Jyotish.
H Jyotish. So you can literally go on there. You can input all of your data. It will generate. I think you have to sign up for the service, but it's free. And then it will even give you. I think it's when he breaks down the houses and the signs and it actually gives you some text from your book as well, doesn't it? I think he's giving you like a kind of rough guide so you can get a sense of what's going on in your chart. That all comes with the breakdown and the interpretation. So that's a great service. And yeah, I've got nothing against it. I think it's very good software. It gives you lots of options in there. It's simple, but everything's there that you need. I mean, I've got more advanced stuff, but like you say, how much of it do you actually use? I use less than 10% of what those softwares are capable of. But I guess people just like to have access to it. If you have a specialized interest, maybe there's something on there that you require to make those calculations. But my point was just to say, after calculating by hand, I got a great appreciation for what work goes on behind the scenes. And we're kind of spoiled, aren't we? I think we're spoiled really as a
not only that, when you do it by hand, you can make mistakes.
Yeah, and I frequently did. It's not.
I mean, calculating the dasha bhuktis was brutal.
Yeah, and I think actually in ancient Hindu you've actually got a table in there for calculating as well, which is great. So
the art and practice, I believe, has it as well.
So if anyone's out there if you're interested in that level of detail, the books cater for that as well. Which is
some people want to be able to figure out how the dashas are calculated or how So yeah, that's.
Okay, well, let's sort of wrap it up there. So thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us, James. I really appreciate that. Just before we sign off, do you want to? So how do people go about getting in contact? And I'll put some links underneath so people can go to where the books and bring the
books are. Let me say this: the books are mostly on Amazon. Okay. and there's a lot of ebooks or hardcover. There's also Book Baby for ebooks. There's also Google Play and Barnes and Noble, I believe, where there are some ebooks that can be purchased as well. But for the hard books, you want Amazon. And when it comes to the ancient Hindu astrology or the art and practice, it's really better to have the book in the hand. But the other ones, you know, the Braha Sutras, that you could get either the hard book or the ebook. Now, the Braha Sutras, I should tell you, is the result of a lifetime. I mean, this was written at the age of 70, and this is something that I learned in Western astrology. The best book was by Isabel Hickey, and it's because she wrote it when she was 70. So when people are writing books at 30 and 40, they don't know that much by that. So this Braha Sutras book, it's my entire life in that one book, and it's not real technical. Well, for some people, they might think it is, but it's really a useful book. It's stuff you cannot learn. When that book came out, there was a review on Amazon. And it said, this book is going to save me years of trying to figure out how this works. It's the subtleties that take a long time of experience.
So whereas like the ancient Hindu was kind of like, I've gone to India, I've learned the system, and here it is. Now Braha Sutras is kind of like the culmination of everything, and it's
written 40 years later.
Yeah,
it's like
you got a chance to check everything out thoroughly.
Yeah. The thing about the ancient Hindu book, the basic book, is that was revised in 2020. So it's not the same book as 86 by a long shot. It's way better.
Yeah, I should say to everybody as well that they've been reformatted. It's a nice large paperback format. I think Braha Sutras is the only hardback, isn't it, out of the ones that
it's hard and soft cover, both.
I do hard and soft. And you know, you've got it's like large print in it. It's easy to read. There's lots of diagrams. It's just much more engaging, and it's a nice hefty book to sit down and read through. So yeah, I'd highly recommend those.
Yep.
Brilliant. Well, we'll wrap it up there. So thank you very much, James. I appreciate your time to do this. I know you're a busy man. And I should just say, if people are interested in getting a reading, just contact you directly, or
jamesbraha.com.
Okay, great.
Or that's my website, or you could just email me. What is it? Jamesbraha@gmail.com. Yeah. Getting confused. Jamesbraha.com, jamesbraha@gmail.com.
I'll put all that underneath as well, so people have all the links. So that's great. Yeah. So thanks again. I appreciate your time, and nice.
Namaste.
Nice to talk to you.
Okay.